Welcome to the Scottish Rite Journal podcast, an audio presentation of the Scottish Rite Journal, brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. This week's article is Reflections on Craft and Creation According to J.R.R. Tolkien by Morgan Smith, and comes from the July-August 2022 issue of the Scottish Rite Journal. While famed Lord of the Rings author J.R.R. Tolkien was not a Mason, the stories he wrote focus on questions of vital interest to Masons: virtue, character, duty, and how to best serve the deity and one's fellow man, even in the face of great adversity. In the following article, Morgan Smith shows us some of the parallels between Tolkien's ideas and those found within key Masonic texts. From its earliest forms, the Masonic tradition has connected craft to moral instruction, for it is the creative force within man that makes him what he is and separates him from the rest of God's creatures. Similar concerns motivated the great fantasy author and Oxford scholar of medieval literature, J.R.R. Tolkien. In 1954, Tolkien drafted a letter on the subject of the creation narrative within its invented mythos, remarking that its central theme lies in the nature of the creative force of God and the presence of God's creative will in his children. From his earliest writings, which later would be published as the Silmarillion, to his most famous works, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, craft acts as a fundamental fabric of Tolkien's stories, a means to illustrate man's relationship with his creator and his moral journey. It is from within Tolkien's perception of craft as a form of subcreation that parallels emerge to the image of God as great architect and artificer and man as builder and craftsman as they are understood in Masonic teachings. The chief characteristic of the deity in Freemasonry relates to his creative and formative power, in the words of Dr. Albert Mackey. Across his writings, Tolkien would name this power the flame imperishable, or the sacred fire. It is the divine creative will which originates with God, but stirs also in his children in their desire to build and to create in the image of their higher creator. In their encounters with Middle-earth, students of Freemasonry would not be unjustified in recalling the same threads of imagery within Masonic tradition. Genesis states that man was created in the image of God, and for Tolkien, this includes the capacity for making. Tolkien would write in his poem on subcreation, Mythopoeia, "We make still by the law in which we are made. One need only observe children building with blocks, painting with their fingers, or telling a story for a glimpse of the creative will of God stirring in man." A philologist and professor of Anglo-Saxon, Tolkien devoted scholarly study to his conception of the creative instinct in man. For him, subcreation in our world is embodied most perfectly by storytellers and mythmakers. In his 1947 seminal essay, On Fairy Stories, Tolkien describes the storyteller as the godlike creator of a secondary world, and the storyteller thus becomes a subcreator after the manner of God in our primary world. Within his fictional legendarium, however, subcreation is represented in craft and the making of art, often initiating and driving the events of his stories. The imagery of craft and building is foundational to Tolkien's work. Those familiar with Tolkien's lore may recall references to craft and divine creative force surrounding the making of the ring itself, the creation of the dwarvish race by Aula, and the declaration of Gandalf in the face of evil that he is foremost the servant of God's creative power. The earliest of events Middle-earth chronicled in the Silmarillion, further, are driven by the actions and fall of the greatest craftsmen among God's children, making it a kind of study on the moral complexities of craft as it relates to possessiveness and power. Tolkien's source materials in Norse, Anglo-Saxon, and Continental Germanic literature from which he drew inspiration for his fiction were likewise rooted in comparable imagery. His retelling of the Old Norse rendering of the Germanic legend of Sigurd, published by his son Christopher in 2009, maintains that Sigurd's journey is shaped by the smith and craftsman Regin, who fostered Sigurd and reforged his broken sword that would slay Fafnir the dragon. That Tolkien carried such elements into his fiction is clear, and one is reminded of a similar act of craft, the reforging of an ancient sword for Aragorn by elven craftsmen, that sets into motion the events that would make him king in Lord of the Rings. Though craft is emphasized as a profound form of subcreation in Tolkien's legendarium, it nonetheless possesses a dual nature. It is no accident that as much as craft is elevated, it is also tied to corruption, that among the great craftsmen of his stories, there is a propensity towards temptation and fall. The greatest evil of the Lord of the Rings, Sauron himself, in fact, was a great smith and craftsman in Tolkien's lore. It is as if to suggest as one comes closer to God in the act of creation, one becomes in danger of falling to darkness. In a letter to publisher Milton Waldman in 1951, Tolkien wrote that corrupt subcreation involves domination, while pure subcreation stems from a love of God and God's creation. Tolkien, a devout student of Catholicism, would have been familiar with the theological implications of such ideas. Students of Masonic tradition may recall the Masonic mythic heritage traced to both the corrupt yet skillful sons of Cain and the virtuous sons of Seth in the building of the Temple of Solomon. This juxtaposition serves to mark the inherent nearness of the act of building to the mind of God, and thus the higher spiritual journey of dual-natured man. Masonic scholar William Preston once described geometry, the foundation of craft, in terms of what it reveals of the mind of God hidden within creation. By geometry, then, we curiously trace nature, through her various windings, to her most concealed recesses. By it we discover the power, the wisdom, and the goodness of the great artificer. The great builders of antiquity erected temples in the image of the cosmos, coming near to the secrets of God's creation in their symbolic act of subcreation. In Freemasonry, as God is the great architect, Masons become little architects in the image of Hiram, likewise participating in the subcreation of temples not made in stone, but in spirit. As one might expect, Professor Tolkien was quite appalled by the Industrial Revolution and the decline of craft in favor of factory. The Masonic tradition safeguards the spirit of craft lost to the roar of modern industry, emphasizing its more ancient virtues of introspection, precision, artistry, and mastery. For modern Masons, Professor Tolkien's work can be viewed as a reminder of the nature of the craftsman and his craft, his moral struggle, his reach towards God, and the creative spark within the self. Any accompanying photographs or citations for this article can be found in the corresponding print edition. The Scottish Rite Journal is published by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the World. Mark Dreisenstock, 32nd degree, KCCH, Managing Editor. I'm your host, Matt Bowers.